Michael Stannard was a barrister who set up his own bank and took on the taxman.
Oh, I think inevitably, I must say, I regret the scheme now, because had somebody said to me 10 years ago, well, if you do this, you'll go to prison, quite plainly, I wouldn't have done it.
Mike Law has a fraud conviction for every stripe on his suit, and yet boasts about his finesse.
But the whole package, from the presentation, the paperwork, to the clothing, has to be spot on. And I've always placed a lot of emphasis on detail, and I suppose that's why I've been successful.
David Hodgson helped a gang pull a multi-million-pound mobile phone fraud from a place you'd last expect.
Anyone that actually was dealing with us would certainly not have believed that that was the premises that they were coming from. No. We're talking about a porter cabin in the middle of a pig yard.
This is the story of the barrister, the accountant, and the farmer who tried to beat the system and lost. Fraudsters don't stand out in a crowd, and, as they see them, their crimes are often so close to what's honest and legal. Michael Stannard was a barrister with wealth, an Oxford education, and no criminal record. It was all at risk when he tried to make $1.5 million from the taxman by setting up his own bank.
Well, I think it was a reasonably ingenious scheme. The Revenue and I appear to have slight disagreement on this point.
For someone who drew up clever tax avoidance schemes for a living, it was the boldest move ever to outwit the Inland Revenue.
It's really a case that you're playing a game of football with another side that's changing the rules as they go along.
The bank Michael Stannard set up had no grand offices and no staff, apart from himself, and could even be carried around. It was a bank in a bag. That didn't stop him awarding it the grandest of names.
The bank, with extreme modesty, was called the Investment Bank of Europe and the United States. And I saw absolutely no objection to the payments taking the form of transfers within the computer's memory and disk.
It was the cheekiest money-making idea yet for a man with a lifelong desire to get one up on any set of rules.
I think even at school, I was regarded as perhaps a little bit of a rebel, in the sense I would push every rule to its limits. I just enjoyed the mental challenge when a set of rules is established of finding a way around it legally.
On becoming a barrister in 1973, Stannard went straight into tax law and enjoyed 25 high-earning years, helping the rich save lots of tax.
It's very challenging because what you're doing is you're taking legal concepts which are frequently quite antiquated or totally used for other purposes and twisting them to your advantage to find some loophole in the tax legislation.
The people who devise these schemes are normally very clever. It takes a great deal of skill to come up with a scheme.
Well, I was described in court by my counsel during my sentencing hearing as a tax anorak, which I think sums it up admirably. I've never looked at an anorak in the same light again.
The Inland Revenue don't like people who sell tax avoidance schemes and are going to be fairly vicious towards them. This is a game where at the present time the Inland Revenue seem to be winning much more often than they're losing.
It's very much a cat and mouse game, and of course the cat has the advantage in that, as I said earlier, changes the rules.
Undaunted, Stannard in the early 90s set forth on a provocative scheme to make money directly for himself. He would buy up companies with juicy piles of cash, ready to pay corporation tax they owed. He would lend them lots of money so there was lots of interest to pay. The interest would write off the profits they had. No tax was left owing, and Stannard himself could keep the piles of cash.
The scheme essentially created a tax deduction. Taking days when interest rates were about 10%, assume a company with a potential tax liability on profits of $1 million. I would acquire the company, to use loose terminology, arrange for another company of mine to lend it £10 million, so the company with a potential tax liability would then immediately pay interest of $1 million back to my second company. In tax terms, that gave the taxpayer company the deduction of £1 million, therefore wiping out the tax debt entirely and leaving me with £1 million.
For some years, the taxman accepted such schemes. And, with well-known banks making the necessary loans, Stannard did very nicely from it. Then the revenue cracked down and warned off the banks.
Banks were no longer being helpful with tax schemes. I had no problem with some of the biggest names in the business for a number of years, and the decree came out, do not get involved in tax schemes. So I had to find an alternative.
Enter Michael Stannard's very own Investment Bank of Europe and the United States, the bank in a bag. Cleverly, the bank was designed to keep banking watchdogs at bay. It was registered in Scotland but traded overseas. It had an address in Hong Kong but no customers in China. The man in full control was Stannard.
The idea for running the bank came to me initially because of the need to do a number of payments between companies, all of which were under common control. And because of the difficulties owing to political pressure put on the big banks in getting banks to do these transactions, I decided the logical thing to do was to form an in-house bank to keep the accounts of all the companies.
The scheme relied on a final twist. Stannard needed to make loans of more than 100 million. Neither he nor his bank had anything like such money. But he was sure it didn't matter, and that if he put the right entries into computerized accounts, in law, he was lending 100 million.
Quite simply, each company would have an account with IBEAS, as I called it, Investment Bank of Europe and the United States, and one account would be debited on the computer, another account would be credited in exactly the same way as if they'd had accounts with Barclays Bank. The account of one company would be debited at Barclays, the account of another would be credited. No real money, if one may use that term, would actually move around Barclays banking hall.
When the computer transfers were done, Stannard had made himself £1.6 million. But it would not turn out so easy. The next move would be the revenues.